All right, we are with Audra Hilse, and she is going to take us through the Ayn Rand in film and on stage exhibit here at OCON. So take it away, Audra.
Thanks, Jonathan. Yep, so this is the Ayn Rand Archives exhibit here this year at OCON. We're not in Hollywood, but we're kind of in proximity to Hollywood here in Anaheim, California. So we thought we would take a look at Ayn Rand's film and stage career, the elements of her work that touch on these areas. Her novels get a lot of focus, rightly, her later nonfiction, but there's some really interesting history behind kind of her film and stage work as well. So we thought we'd highlight that here. So we've got a film of her, or photo of her on the set of the Fountainhead film, some advertising for that, and then we'll head back into the exhibit.
All right.
So our first section here, talking about the very earliest parts of her film career. So people may know the story. One of her first jobs when she arrived in Hollywood in late 1926, she's been in the US only a few months, and she has a chance meeting with director Cecil B. DeMille, and he gets her a part as an extra on his, he's filming The King of Kings, one of his very well-known films. So that's actually her first Hollywood job. And then DeMille also ends up hiring her as a junior screenwriter. So she doesn't write any like complete film scripts for him, but the notebook that we have here, she did some research and some scenario writing, so just thinking of what would a story be for this film if a script was going to get written. None of that, nothing is produced from her work for him, but it's an early writing job in Hollywood, which is what she was looking for at the time. This one's kind of fun, the skyscraper scenario, because it also, it gets her back in touch, a fortuitous accident with Frank O'Connor, whom she had met on the set of King of Kings, and they got married 2 years later, and they were married for 50 years then, until the time of Frank's death in 1979. So there was an important personal benefit to Ayn Rand for having been working on that scenario for DeMille, even though nothing came of it as far as the film goes.
All right.
Her next real kind of success during this time, she does sell a film scenario and script called Red Pawn. The money's very helpful for them, but nothing, again, really happens with that. But the next thing that she writes, which actually kind of comes out into the world, is the stage play that we generally know today as Night of January 16th. So we have some items in this case related to Night of January 16th. There were different productions of this. So the earliest one is kind of related to these three photos. It was first produced in Hollywood. The producer and director of that time wanted to call it Woman on Trial. It got picked up for a Broadway production then and was quite successful, had over 300 performances on Broadway. That director, who's a different person, wanted to call it Night of January 16th. It was then adapted for like amateur theater, stock theater sorts of things by a person who was not Ayn Rand, and he made a lot of changes to it that she didn't approve of. But that it was popular because of the the unique aspect of it. People may not know the story. It's the story of a murder trial, and the unique bit that Ayn Rand built into it is that a jury is always selected from the audience, and that jury makes a guilty, not guilty decision at the end of the play, and there are two different endings for the play depending on which verdict the jury brings in. And so, the big poster in here is from a Paris production. We've got other artifacts in the archives. There were many international productions of this over the years as well. And finally, in 1973, Ayn Rand was able to be involved in a production of her version that she, approved of. And that was produced finally under her original title for the play, which was Penthouse Legend.
Very
so we have
cool.
that. Then moving on, we're probably all most familiar with We the Living as Ayn Rand's first novel, her first published novel. But it has some interesting stage and film history as well, actually. So in 1940, a few years after the novel was published, Ayn Rand actually wrote a stage play version of We the Living, which she called The Unconquered. We've got a playbill related to that here. That, unfortunately, was not a very successful production. There were 6 shows put on in New York, but it didn't end up being successful, so they closed it after the small number of shows. And then during this time, Ayn Rand is mostly working on The Fountainhead, her next novel. But something then, as we get into the 1940s, World War II breaks out. There's lost contact then between kind of the Axis powers in Europe and the rest of Europe and America. And so it's not until 1946 that Ayn Rand learns that in Italy, during the war, a studio in Italy produced a film version of We the Living without her knowledge or consent. And so she learns about this after the war is over. And it starts kind of a long saga of her trying to get some compensation, since the rights were not cleared with her the way they would have been ideally. But she also is able to get a hold of a copy of the film, which was originally produced as 2 movies, actually. And we've got a letter here from someone who's involved on the Italian side, promising that the film is coming so that she can view it. And she, overall, she actually liked the film production. They, for various reasons, had created their film script by mostly just lifting the dialogue straight out of the novel, which was a good choice on their part. They had certainly inserted some anti-Semitic comments, some pro-fascist comments that Ayn Rand strongly disapproved of. So she wanted some editing of the movie to occur, removing some of those remarks before she could give any kind of approval for it. But she strongly approved of, say, actress Alida Valli was cast as Kira. She strongly approved of that casting choice. And so there were a lot of aspects of the film that she liked. It's actually available today on home DVD, and there's even a remastered 80th anniversary version playing in select theaters worldwide right now, so you can look that up. Maybe one of those theaters is near you, but I think that version will come to streaming services at some point in the future. So that film is out there for people to see. And in the cube here, we've got a page of the stage adaptation that she had written. Just to give a little more about that.
Awesome.
And then we'll keep moving right along. Of course, during the late 1930s into the 1940s, she wrote The Fountainhead, finally gets The Fountainhead published in 1943. Also in 1943, she sells the film rights for The Fountainhead to Warner Brothers for $50,000, which in today's money is somewhere in the vicinity of $1 million. It's a very life-changing amount of money for her and her husband. We've got the big canvas here. This is Frank O'Connor, Ayn Rand's husband. This is a 1930s era kind of portrait photo of him. He did work as an actor in film for a while in the 20s and 30s, and then moved on to other things later in his life. But one gets a sense of what appealed to Ayn Rand about him. But in selling the film rights to The Fountainhead to Warner Brothers, she also works out with them that she's going to write a first draft of a screenplay for The Fountainhead for them. They're not promising her involvement in the final, screenplay yet, but they do want her to do a first take on it. And so for that and other reasons, she and her husband moved. They had moved to New York for a while. They moved back to Hollywood, back to California. In 1944, she writes that initial script for Warner Brothers, and then gets involved in other film projects. So producer and director Hal Wallace, you'll know him from Casablanca, The Maltese Falcon, some well-known films. He actually hires Ayn Rand to come be a screenwriter for him, a contract screenwriter. And she worked on a number of projects for him then. Love Letters is probably the most well-known. She wrote the screenplay for Love Letters. It was filmed. It was nominated for some Academy Awards at the time. That came out in 1945. And she also, not totally by herself, but she also worked on a screenplay for him, which was originally titled Don't Ever Grieve Me. You can see kind of a full copy of this screenplay right here. But the movie actually was released as under the title You Came Along. So those are the two projects she did for Hal Wallace that came to completion. And then she worked on other projects for him where maybe she wrote a partial screenplay or maybe even a full screenplay, but they weren't actually produced. One interesting project that she did for him, which was a lot of research and notes, an outline, and then a partial screenplay, was Top Secret, which was her take on the making of the atomic bomb. And this handwritten page of notes is very interesting. She actually interviewed Robert Oppenheimer as research for this particular project. It didn't work out into a film. Hal Wallace kind of sold the project to a different film studio, and they did produce a movie about the making of the atomic bomb, but it didn't use any of Ayn Rand's ideas or material, unfortunately. So there's that.
All right.
And we'll just wrap up then. Once the Fountainhead movie was complete, she did get pulled back in by Warner Brothers to do the final script for the Fountainhead film. And then her career in Hollywood really ended at that point. She was deep into work on Atlas Shrugged by then. The Fountainhead film came out in 1949. And she really focused the next almost decade of her life then, completing Atlas Shrugged, getting it published. And she and her husband moved back to New York in the early 1950s, never went back to California. And then the only other kind of film history for her then is that once Atlas Shrugged was published, she did start to think in various ways about a potential film version of Atlas Shrugged. And that did not come into being during her lifetime. There were a couple projects with other people. So Al Ruddy, the director of The Godfather, approached her. He was interested in making a movie version of Atlas Shrugged. That project didn't work out. And then later in the 1970s, she actually signs a contract with NBC to make a TV miniseries version. And then that gets a little bit further along, and then leadership at NBC changed, and they canceled that project as well. And at a certain point in there, Ayn Rand decided, well, I might just have to do it myself if it's going to happen. So she actually, at that point, did start working on writing the script for this TV miniseries herself. She did not complete it before her death in March of 1982, unfortunately, but we do know we have pages of it dated January of 1982, so really up until just a couple of months before she passed away, she was working in various ways on that project. So we have some material about those things in here. And I'll point out a fun tidbit on the notes on the blue paper here are some brainstorming from her about potential casting choices. And then on the right side, the second line up from the bottom, there may be a little hard to make out on the video, but she actually wrote Princess from Star Wars. I have zero evidence one way or the other about whether she saw Star Wars. I suspect no. But she made these notes in 1978. A New Hope had come out in 1977. And something about the look of Carrie Fisher had Ayn Rand thinking about her in relation to a film version of Atlas Shrugged. So that's a fun tidbit. And that's a quick version, but hopefully a comprehensive overview of Ayn Rand's film and stage career.
Well, that's great, Audra. You're certainly very knowledgeable about all of this. So thank you for walking us through the exhibit.
You're welcome. And due credit to my colleagues in the archives, Brandon Lisi and Jeff Britting, who put in a lot of work to make this exhibit happen as well.
Excellent. Well, thank you very much.